Hello, everyone. I'm Dr. Bradley Wolfe, and I'm going over Chapter 4 in Communication in the Real World on Nonverbal Communication. And this edition of the book is the one published by James Madison University. So nonverbal communication is the process of generating meaning using behavior other than words. So anything besides the words, right? The words are the symbols that we use to convey information. Anything else that we do, my hand gestures, my tone of voice, anything else, my facial expressions, the clothes I'm wearing, that's all nonverbal communication. And so we're going to go over various forms of nonverbal communication and learn a little bit about it in this chapter. So the first one pointed out here is about paralanguage, which is a vocal element of verbal. The vocal element is spoken words, and the vocal nonverbal element is paralanguage. So paralanguage is the vocalized but not verbal part of a spoken message, such as the speaking rate, the volume, pitch. Sometimes if I get very excited or nervous, I start to talk fast, right? So that's part of my emotions coming across in my nonverbal communication. Sometimes if I'm tired, I'll speak quieter, or sometimes people even mumble instead of articulating their words well and enunciating everything. So different factors can impact how we're speaking. If I want to get if I'm speaking in front of a classroom, I want to make sure everyone hears me. I'm going to speak louder. So that's the volume as well. So there's a lot of intention behind our nonverbal communication. It can be intentional, it can be non-intentional. Most of it is not intentional, right? If I'm tired and mumbling, I want the person to hear what I'm saying, but I'm just to overcome with other things to be able to, articulate myself well. And so that's something to consider. All the paralanguage, right? It is part of it goes right alongside our words. The words we say, but how we say them can impact the meaning. If you even think about sarcasm, if you say something in a sarcastic way, people are going to be able to pick up that you're not being, you're not saying that to be truthful or accurate, right? You're saying it, in that way. Usually people can pick up, but some people can't pick up. If people are on the autism spectrum, it may be more difficult for them to pick up that paralanguage, and they'll just look at the kind of the words that you're saying and take them at face value. So nonverbal communication conveys important information. Some studies claim that close to 90% of meanings derive from nonverbal signals, but some others say it's closer to 65%. But otherwise, it's the majority of the meaning comes across from nonverbal communication, majority of meaning of what we get, of what we understand. So that's why if we're like texting each other and we just are using words, right, it's harder to understand the meaning, and we may have to clarify things or be more specific in how we talk. Also, people use emojis, they use memes. They'll send that visual communication to each other because that visual element of it adds some nonverbal communication to even through text message, through Messenger, Snapchat, whatever it may be. Right? We like that nonverbal communication because it gives us a fuller picture of what the person means. Nonverbal communication is more involuntary than verbal. So this is, again, not mediated communication. In mediated communication, you have to be very intentional to add those nonverbal signals. But if we're just talking in a face-to-face interaction, nonverbal communication is much more involuntary, right? We're normally not doing things, right? Sometimes we'll just talk with our hands. Our hands will just start doing things. We're not thinking like, oh, I should talk with my hands in most situations, but we're just trying to move along the conversation. Even if we're on the telephone with someone, we still will use hand gestures, right? We'll still have facial expressions, even if we know the other person can't see them, because it's so involuntary, right? It's just things that are coming across. The involuntary nature of nonverbal communication also makes it more difficult to fake or control. Sometimes they talk about in like police interviews, that interrogators, some people, right, criminals, mastermind criminals, right? They work very hard at keeping their nonverbal communication to a minimum or being able to fake how they're interacting, but there's still some little twitches in the eye and other small things that people can look for that are hard to control, right? It's very involuntary overall. We also see like other professions like poker players, actors, they may have to have more awareness and control over their nonverbal communication. So it's something you certainly can work on, but it's hard. And normally in daily interactions, you're not going to be controlling most of your nonverbal communication. Nonverbal communication can also be more ambiguous. So we know that there's a symbolic and abstract nature of language, and it can lead to misunderstandings, right? Even when we're using verbal communication, we can interpret the words differently. But nonverbal communication is even more ambiguous. There are a lot of different ways to read or even not read them. It may be intentionally reading, it may be unintentionally reading, and they don't necessarily have one specific meaning. So the example here, it says if someone winks at you, what does that mean? Why is this person winking at me? You may be confused. You may interpret it in a certain way. Hey, maybe it's flirtatious. Maybe it's saying, hey, we're on the same page here. Maybe they just had a little something in their eye and it wasn't meant to communicate anything, but it does, right? There's that saying in communication that we cannot not communicate, even if we're not trying to communicate with somebody. They may say, oh, that person winked at me, and the other person, I wasn't even looking at you. My eye twitched, whatever, right? So there's a lot of different ways for the same nonverbal communication to be interpreted by people. Nonverbal communication is also more credible. Again, it's hard to lie, and some people can work really hard to control their nonverbal communication. But if you're in times of stress or in danger, the nonverbal communication, especially, is more instinctual, and we're relying on those systems that we've learned of how to act. We see some nonverbal communication is across cultures, but some of it is culturally specific too. So some is some signs, ways of communicating specific to maybe your community or culture, how you interact, but other things are universal. Some are emotions, like smiling, right? That's more of a happy gesture that's universal. They've also seen if you win something, that putting hands up in the air, right, making yourself bigger. Even blind people do this, even though they've never seen anyone do it before, right? That's just kind of human behavior. So some of this nonverbal communication is just through humans, right? It's just part of humanity. But other parts of it may be more culturally specific, again, on how people interact. Like sometimes the head movements, saying yes or no can be different in some cultures. Interact in India, they have this, kind of head bobble, which has some meaning too. So it depends on the culture what those different nonverbal communication means. So you have to pay attention to that. How much nonverbal communication is in the message too. But we'll go to the next section here on functions of nonverbal communication. So, of course, nonverbal communication conveys meaning. We can use gestures like a hand gesture to reinforce some verbal communication. Here's giving a thumbs up, which in the United States is, yeah, hey, okay, we're working together. Things are going well. But there's other hand gestures. Again, those can be culturally specific, depending on where you are in the world. So if you're traveling abroad, you may want to be more careful and what certain hand gestures mean if you're trying to communicate, especially if you have a language barrier. You may be going to some gestures that but the gestures don't necessarily translate either. So it's important to reflect upon your situation and find ways to, understand that meaning. But it conveys meaning between people, whether it's the meaning you intended or not, right? That, may be different, but it definitely conveys meaning. So it says it like if you're in a quiet situation, and verbal communication would be disruptive. You may just use a hand gesture. Hey, come on over here. Like if you're in a library and you don't want to talk loudly, or if you're in a really crowded or loud place, you may just wave at them, because if I talk to you, you're not going to hear me. It also talks about here with mixed messages when the verbal and nonverbal signals contradict each other. Someone may say you can't do anything right in a mean tone, but follow it up with a wink to indicate the person's teasing or joking. So mixed messages can lead to some uncertainty and confusion on part of the receivers. But if you know the person well, you probably know how communication works between you two and the intention that the person has. I've noticed that with some of my friends, especially, not as recently, but when I was younger, I would communicate over text messages, and I, just tend to be very direct and, blunt with people. And so I had friends say, "Oh, why, Bradley, why are you being so mean to me?" And they're like, "Wait, Bradley's not a mean person. He's okay." So let me try and read this again from Bradley. What was Bradley trying to say? And it was just that I was just being very blunt and frank, but I wasn't trying to be mean. But it came off as mean in a written word. So again, you got to be careful with what you're saying, especially through those text messages where you don't have the nonverbal communication. Whereas if they had me like saying it to their face, they would, my tone of voice would convey that I'm not trying to be mean about it, but I'm just trying to share, communicate a message or give them information. So again, that nonverbal communication is very helpful when you lack it. So now when I write emails, I've been much more intentional about, okay, I need to say some positive things, work on the relationship, especially with students who may not know me very well. I try and be very nice about it, and I'll include smiley faces, emojis. Some of that's that nonverbal communication, exclamation points, that can be nonverbal communication. So there's things you can do to add nonverbal communication, even when using text. So nonverbal communication also influences others. So it talks here a little bit about deception. So people may conceal information, omit, or exaggerate information. So verbal information can be to blame for the content of the deception, but the nonverbal communication also partners with that deceptive act to make it more convincing. So if you're trying to lie to someone, you may use that nonverbal communication to help convey that message. I've been watching the TV show Traitors. They have it in both United States, England, Australia, New Zealand. And so in the show, few people are the traitors and everyone else are the faithfuls, and you're trying to figure out who the traitors are in your group. And sometimes the traitors, they'll be using that nonverbal communication, right? They'll be, upset about the situation. It's a very stressful situation. So they'll be crying. But they'll be using that, okay, I'm crying right now. How do I explain these tears in this context to make them not think I'm a traitor? And so they'll add some verbal communication that's a lie on top of their real emotions. And so, again, maybe not faking the nonverbal communication, but adding words as part of that deceptive process to make people think the nonverbal communication means something else. So again, you can read more about some of this. Oh, it talks about reality TV shows like Survivor and Big Brother as well, where they have that social game. Traitors is similar to those if you're more familiar with Survivor and Big Brother. Nonverbal communication also regulates the flow of conversation. So even a pause, right? A pause can be a nonverbal communication, allowing somebody else to talk. Sometimes, I'm teacher at work, classroom etiquette, raise your hand when you're ready to talk, or even kind of stick my hand out there to show some nonverbal communication that I have something to say or add to the conversation. It also talks about your pitch and tone. Hey, I'm ending a thought, or ending the conversation. Sometimes if someone's giving a speech, they'll end with thank you. That's what I always encourage my students to do, just end with thank you to know that it's over with. Especially sometimes if the conclusion in the speech isn't built out super well. Sometimes you can do it. Really good speakers don't have to end with thank you because they build out their conclusion to make it clear they're wrapping up. They use the tone of voice, right? They know what they're doing. Even for me, though, I use thank you at the end, right? Because I want to be clear with people. Thank you for listening, thank you for coming. Show that I've wrapped up. So nonverbal communication is often regulates the flow of conversation, but certainly you can use verbal communication for that means as well. Sometimes, depending, again, if we look at culture, it can be culturally specific how we regulate the flow of conversation. And if there's some cultures which are very comfortable with crosstalk. So two people talking at the same time, and that shows that you're very involved and engaged in the conversation. Me, I'm like super introverted. I'm not going to interrupt somebody. Again, classroom etiquette, we each take our turn, go around. So I don't want to step on anyone's toes. So if I'm with someone who's very extroverted or even more, in a different culture where that crosstalk's more prevalent, they may see me as very cold and distant, and I see them as I can't get a word in edgewise. And so we have to figure out how to regulate the conversation between these two different cultural etiquettes. I once was in a meeting where they put all the extroverts in a group and the introverts in a group. So me and the introvert group, we went around, we took our turn and went around the circle. We went very orderly to take our turns. Whereas the extrovert group, multiple people talking at the same time, bouncing all over, everyone just jumping in. And it was very interesting just to see even introversion versus extroversion, some of those differences in how we regulate conversational flow. But certainly that nonverbal communication is a part of that the extroverts understand when, they're joining in with each other, and maybe based on the expression saying, hey, no, this person, needs more space or less space. So again, we use that to, again, regulate the flow of conversation. Nonverbal communication also affects relationships, can bring people together in a very positive way. It also can push people apart. So it talks about immediacy behaviors. Our verbal and nonverbal behaviors to lessen the real or perceived physical or psychological distance between communicators. And it includes things like smiling, nodding, making eye contact, and sometimes a very social, polite, and professional touch. So you can, put a hand on someone's shoulder, if it's appropriate. I'm not a very touchy-feely person. Once in a while, I will to get someone's attention. Again, regulate the flow of conversation. I'll put my hand on their shoulder just to show that I want to interact with them. So that's certainly something to regulate the flow of conversation, but it's also an immediacy behavior to show, hey, we're close together. All right, we feel close, we're comfortable, having some light professional contact. But I'm more just okay, I'm going to smile, I'm going to nod, I'm going, right? That's nonverbal communication. I'm not using words, but I'm showing that I'm listening, making eye contact, or sometimes not making eye contact, depending on the culture. Sometimes it's a sign of respect not to make eye contact with a person. There was a case down in the southern United States. It was a judge who worked with a lot of defendants from Mexico, and in Mexican culture, it is rude and disrespectful to make eye contact, like it's aggressive, like, oh, I'm going to look at you even though I did something wrong. So they want to look down and say, hey, I accept responsibility. I'm shameful of what I did, and so I don't want to make eye contact. Whereas the judge was from the United States culture. She's like, you make eye contact with me, you're not looking at me, you're avoiding me, right? And so very different cultural perspective. And so she thought these defendants were being disrespectful to her until she learned more about the Mexican culture. Then she's like, oh shoot, they were trying to be respectful to me, but I interpreted it differently. And that's what we talk about when nonverbal communication is ambiguous, right? Sometimes based on our culture, we may expect different things, even just based on our personal preferences. Again, being introvert, extrovert, a lot of other things. A rural versus more, more urban area is going to expect different things. I live in a rural community, so oftentimes if I'm walking down the street, you smile, you say hi to the person, even if you don't know them, right? You use some of those immediacy behaviors. But in a large urban center, you're passing a lot of people. You're probably going to be a little more distant with others. So again, some of these are culturally specific, what the norms are. Nonverbal communication can also express our identity, such as like the clothes we wear. Often when I'm teaching, I wear a collared shirt. When I'm not teaching, I don't like wearing collared shirts as much, but I like short sleeves. I've tried wearing long sleeve shirts, but I don't like the material on my sleeves. I'm just not used to it. So, so I found just, okay, it's a polo, right? Polos worked really well for me. I also have other shirts that I can just kind of button up shirts to go over another shirt. But again, those are I'm trying to convey something about my identity, saying, hey, I'm professional. I come to this, I'm trying to show that part of my identity in that situation. Whereas other parts of me wear a fun shirt. Even at my wedding, I wore a shirt with Kirby on it. It was a black and white shirt. Kirby's the little pink Nintendo character that's kind of like a ball. So because it was my wedding, I'm not very formal. Again, I don't like wearing collared shirts. So I'm not going to dress up even at my wedding. But it expressed something about my identity for sure, that we weren't wearing suits or formal dress materials. We had a more casual wedding potluck in the park. So again, something to how do you want to convey yourself? How do you want to convey your identity in that situation? One of the things I like at Ridgewater College, where I teach, is that even up to the president, we're not super formal here. If someone from the system office comes, then the administrators will wear their suits and try and be a little bit more professional. But otherwise, this kind of white collar business casual clothing is acceptable. So I like that. I think that's part of working in a rural community too. Maybe some of that cultural difference. So again, there's a lot of unique factors that you have to look for. It also talks here about artifacts, which are objects or possessions that surround us. So if you see behind me, I have probably a little camera, but I have lots of little Funko Pops in my office that expresses something about my identity, some of my kind of geekiness, quirkiness. So I use those, and it surrounds in it, and I like it. Right, it brings some joy into my life having those little people. I have them in my house too. I have a lot of them, but that expresses something about ourselves. So artifacts can be the clothing we wear, the jewelry, space decorations, all of that. And sometimes, again, norms are explicit, sometimes they're implicit in how we're supposed to present ourselves in situations. So there are different types of nonverbal communication. I'm bad at pronouncing things. I have a speech impediment, so kinesics means movement. So it's the study of hand, arm, body, and face movements. So again, I'm using my hands right here as I'm pronouncing this. We have facial expressions, but it's really that physical things about movement that we're conveying. Then gestures, which can be part of it, but there's different types of gestures. So there's adapters, there's emblems, and there's illustrators. So adapters are touching behaviors and movements that indicate internal states related to arousal or anxiety. Sometimes if I'm walking, I'll kind of tap my fingers together if I'm anxious, just kind of to ground myself. So that's an example of an adapter. We also have emblems. So emblems are gestures that have specific agreed upon meaning within a cultural context. So here's the okay side, which is in the United States. That's what it means in other countries. That can mean different things. It can be something a little more vulgar, especially I think you have to turn it around, and then maybe it is that way that it's can be vulgar in some cultures. So again, it's specific to the cultural context. And then there's illustrators as well. I want to make sure I have this right. Do they delete illustrators and just not have it there? they talk about emblems and adapters, and they got out illustrators. They edited this book, but illustrators are just to illustrate a meaning or kind of convey using your hands or body gestures just to create more meaning to kind of bring it to life. So if we're saying something's like this big, oh, I caught a big fish the other day, right? That's an example of an illustrator. So head movements and posture. So sometimes I have bad body posture, so I have to sit upright in my chair, keep my shoulders up. I slouch, right? I don't sit right. So that conveys meaning to people. That conveys meaning to people about how we look. People who have better body posture may be seen as more professional in certain situations. Again, depending on the context. I once saw a panel, and there was the chief of police on the panel, and she was a short woman, but she didn't even rest on the back of her chair. She had just upright body posture, just sat there, and I'm like, how do you have that good a body posture? Like, that sounds uncomfortable to me. I always lean back in my chair and rest a bit, but she was upright, not even touching the back of her chair, and she just sat there. I'm like, wow, very interesting. But it conveys meaning, right? It was conveying meaning about who she is, about the way that she was sitting on that panel. So we look at head movements, we look at body posture. It can, again, convey meaning. It can be interpreted differently. How we, perceive those head movements may different, again, depending on the culture or depending on the person. So it talks about a head tilt. Sometimes that can be like if you're confused about something, you tilt your head. My dog does this. My dog Chester, he just tilts his head, and it's so cute, right? He's trying to understand us. Like if we say words he doesn't know, and he's like, "You're talking to me, but I don't understand you." So he keeps tilting his head, and I'll keep tilting it more, and it's very funny. But again, we're interpreting even the nonverbal communication of a dog, right? You can interpret the nonverbal communication of your pets or animals, right? It conveys meaning. It's not just humans that use nonverbal communication. There's also eye contact, or talking about oculesics, which comes from the Latin word oculus, meaning the eye. So again, eye contact. I've talked to some examples of eye contact already, but certainly it helps convey information. Sometimes, I'm from Minnesota, so they talk about a norm in Minnesota is not to make eye contact, to stand next to the person you're talking to, or at a 90-degree angle, so you're both looking at the same point into the distance. It seems to be more common, but sometimes depending on the relationship you have with a person, you may want to have eye contact with them as you're having a conversation. So that changes as well. Even with this giving this video lecture, I'm making eye contact either with my camera here or with a little video of myself on the screen where I see myself. That's often where I'm making eye contact with when my eyes are off the page, when I'm not looking for something where to go next. But the eye contact is going to convey meaning of some sort to other people. So it can communicate that we're paying attention, interested in what the other person's saying. If we're sitting there and we're on our phone, oh, right, I'm looking at my phone, I'm not paying attention to you because I'm lacking eye contact. So again, it conveys a message. It may not be the message that you intended. It may not be an accurate message that the other person is decoding, but certainly you're sending a message and the person is receiving a message. Then there's facial expressions. So we're supposed to smile for the camera, right? But we have core groups of facial expressions. You may have seen the movie Inside Out. So there's happiness, joy in the movie, sadness, fear, anger, disgust. And these are very identifiable across cultures. So again, these are just part of human nature. But if you get into other more specific emotions or expressions outside of that range, it may be more culturally specific. So again, often it's good to have a smile on your face, especially like in Japanese culture. They say, oh, you always have to smile. Even their cars have to smile. The front of their cars have to have a little smile to it because they want to have happiness. I had one teacher who studied in Japan for a while, and she said when she got to Japan, she was overwhelmed, stressed. I didn't know where she was going. Her Japanese language wasn't very good at the time, so she was crying, and that was not culturally appropriate to be expressing that sadness in public. So the Japanese people were very helpful in getting her to where she wanted to go. It's like, oh, you should not be crying. So please, here, I'll get your taxi. I'll pay for your taxi. I'll tell them where you're going. And then she got to the house of her host family, and they're like, oh, you're crying. And they're just like, I don't know how to handle you crying. Right? I just met you. You're a stranger to me. I just please go cry in the other room and pull yourself together because I literally do not know how to handle this. So they were, again, trying to be very nice, but what is culturally appropriate in a situation? In the United States, if you're crying or distressed because you're stressed out, it may be more acceptable to cry in public, and people may still want to help you as well. But again, it depends on how we're interpreting that information. So haptics is about touch. I've talked a little bit previously about how touch, you can have some professional touch. If you're closer with someone, you may sit closer with them. You may put your arms around somebody, holding hands with a significant other. Certainly it conveys meaning. It conveys, the relationship we have with a person, or whether we're not supposed to touch. Some people may be more comfortable with touch than others. So again, and we look at generational differences too, what's appropriate. So they talk sometimes in workplace, people will overstep, some people are just very much huggers. So they'll put their arms around each other. Some of that's very cultural too. There's some cultures which, you put your arms around each other, you're very physically interacting. And it may, like, to me, I'm not much of a toucher, as I said, so that may seem strange to me, but other ones, it's very normal for people to be touching. I have one friend from Nepal, and when he talks to me, if we're close to each other, he's always touching me, and I'm like, "Why are you touching me?" Right? But it's just his culture, right? And he's showing that we're close colleagues, we're working together on this, and so it's very friendly and normal for him. And he probably views me as very cold or distant because I'm not engaging in that touch back, because that's not my cultural norm. So some of it's, again, based on our specific culture with that. So haptics is touch. Vocalics talks about paralanguage refers to the vocalized but nonverbal part of the message. Vocalics is the study of paralanguage. So those vocal qualities that go along with the message. I've talked about that earlier a bit, so you certainly can read through this again, but pitch, again, can be used to regulate a conversation. The speaking rate is how fast or slow that somebody's speaking. There's a lot to reflect on within paralanguage. Certainly you can read through that more. I'll highlight some of these things down here. So repetition is a vocalic clue that reinforces other verbal or nonverbal messages, or saying "I'm not sure" with an uncertain tone is an example of that. Complementing, when they modify a nonverbal meaning and they come together to add some, is elaborating or modifying verbal or nonverbal meaning. Saying "I love sweet potatoes," but would add context to the sentence, such as the degree that the person loves sweet potatoes, or the use of sarcasm. So again, so complimenting is not necessarily saying the same message, but it's going along and modifying that message. Accenting is emphasizing a specific part of the message to determine meaning. She is my friend. She is my friend. She is my friend. Right? Those all have different meaning, what word we're emphasizing. Substituting, so vocalic cues can take place part of another verbal or nonverbal cue. So saying "uh-huh" instead of "I'm listening, understand what you're saying," right? Just off nod or head, yeah. Right. So "yep" is verbal, right? Verbal. That's substituting, right? Just say, yeah, just saying "uh-huh" is a substituting. Regulating vocalic clues to help regulate conversation. So again, the falling pitch, the slow rate of speaking indicates the end of a speaker's turn. And the contradicting vocalic cues may contradict other verbal or nonverbal signals. Someone could say "I'm fine" in a quick short tone that indicates otherwise. I'm fine, right? Probably not fine. So that's a little bit about vocalics. Then proxemics refers to how space and distance is used to influence communication. Again, this is very culturally specific. So this talks more in the United States based on the different types of space. So public space is 12 plus feet. You try and give each other some space in public. If it's crowded, you're going to be kind of pushed together, and you may start to feel uncomfortable in a crowded environment. Social space is 4 to 12 feet. So being a little bit more close to each other in a social zone, just talking to each other, more professional or casual interaction. Again, this is more in the United States. I've interacted. I had one manager who was from Mexico, and he would come right up to me, just like an inch away from my nose when he's talking to me, just right up to me. And that made me uncomfortable, right? That was not my cultural norm, but it's his cultural norm. We also see that in many Arabic cultures to have closer social space. So sometimes it may be good just to sit down or have separate chairs to, help someone from the United States feel comfortable in that interaction, just to understand those spaces are different. But again, if I'm stepping away, if I'm backing off, it may make me seem cold or distant to that other person. So it's not that one is right or one is wrong, but they're just different, and we need to learn how to interact across those differences. So then 0 to 4 feet may be our personal space. And then I don't know how 0 feet is. I mean, you can touch each other in a personal space, I guess, but the intimate space is 0 to 1.5 feet. So again, the closer we're getting to each other, the more intimate it is. Often we'll trust only for the closest friends. family or romantic partners in that intimate space, personal space. We may have some other members of our family who are maybe not as close as, or just on a normal occasion will often be in a personal space with them, but sometimes we'll allow them into that more intimate space. So again, it depends on what happens. But again, it's very culturally specific, and it's also personal. Some people just don't like being touched, right? But sometimes, in a crowded space, in a long line, we may be closer together and have those boundaries pushed, but we understand what, the reason behind in that situation. And so sometimes people will make comments like, we're really packed in here like sardines, or use humor to indicate that they're a bit uncomfortable and, breaching social norms. I've seen that on airplanes too. There was a guy who was larger, he's probably 6 feet tall, maybe 300 pounds, and he was in the aisle. He had a couple other large guys next to him too, who he didn't seem to know. So he was using some humor to diffuse the situation. It's like, oh, we're, 3 big guys here. We're going to get through this. And again, that just helps diffuse the situation, saying, hey, we're all a little bit uncomfortable here, but we just acknowledging the situation. Then chronemics here is a study of how time affects communication. Personal time refers to the ways to which individuals experience time. So there's monochronic time versus polychronic time. I think that talks about here a little bit. But monochronic time is often the majority culture in the United States. We want to be on time. We want to follow things according to our schedule. Polychronic time, you're really just staying in the moment. If this thing takes longer, it takes longer. You're just, focused on what you're doing right now. You'll get to the things later when the time comes. You're okay juggling multiple things at the same time. Whereas, the monochronic time, they want to go through things. It also talks about time in terms of past-oriented cultures, future-oriented cultures, or more present. So past orientations, we see England really cares about their history and heritage. I studied in England for a while, and they really like reminiscing about the past, visiting old castles and, churches and other things like that. That's a really big part of the culture. In the United States, the majority culture in the United States hasn't been on this land for as long. So we're more thinking about the future. We care about some things in the past and not the way you are our past. But certainly we're more future oriented about, it talks about our careers and personal plans, writing out to-do lists, researching future vacations, potential retirement spots. We're really looking forward, both on a personal level, but also as, okay, where are we going as a country? Then it also talks about physical time, refers to fixed days of cycles, years, seasons. Again, depending on the culture, you may use a different calendar. Certainly some religions use different calendars as well, which impacts their, holidays and rituals that they follow. It talks about people with seasonal affective disorder, kind of that winter depression. The different seasons may impact them more. In some places, you don't have seasons. In Minnesota, we have very prominent seasons throughout the year. In some places like, Southern California, if you're living on the coast, it's about 70 degrees year round. You may not be as thoughtful around the different seasons that there are. Also talks about promptness and what's socially acceptable depending on the context. So doctors, often you will show up early to doctor's appointment and be expected to wait. Some people may be running consistently behind based on, if they're executive or celebrity, they may have a lot of things going on and make others wait for them. So that's just, part of how it may be, depending on the situation. And some people may find that very rude, right? Depending on your culture, depending on your personal preferences or how you view and read the situation, it certainly can be different. Then there's personal presentation and the environment. So personal presentation involves both our physical characteristics along with the artifacts that we surround ourselves with. So our physical characteristics includes the body shape, height, weight, attractiveness, other physical features, how much. We don't really have a lot of control over these nonverbal elements, right? We certainly you could diet if you really want to and didn't like the way that your weight was, or you could work out if you don't, if you want a more muscle mass, whatever it may be. But we don't have a ton of control. You can get plastic surgery. Some people get plastic surgery to, change their nose or get Botox to make them not look as old. So you can have some control of your physical characteristics. But often they're kind of set for you, right? You shouldn't judge yourself or beat yourself up too much over them. Some people do, unfortunately. They have those issues. And then the artifacts are clothing, if we wear jewelry, sometimes makeup. These are things which we may have more control over and in the way that we present ourselves. So I dress what's comfortable, right? I have, clothes that I like, and like I said, I have a Kirby shirt and Mario shirts and fun little characters on them, but I just often dress what's comfortable and try and pick a shirt and pants that generally go together, right? I'm not super picky about it, but some people are very more focused on making sure they look nice and wanting to present themselves in a certain way, or they may be like goth and want to wear all black with chains and other things. So again, you may have a certain look you're going for. That's part of your uh, personal presentation um, that you're trying to get across. So the last section of this chapter 4.4 talks about nonverbal communication competence. Certainly, as you learn more about nonverbal communication, you may be able to read other people's cues better, but you also may be able to understand that, hey, miscommunication can happen. And we shouldn't just jump to the first conclusion that we interpret. Maybe you ask for questions or clarification saying, hey, I saw that expression on your face. Is everything all right? All right, you seem a little bit upset with me, right? Follow up with those messages and use some verbal communication to decode what's going on. So it has some guidelines for sending nonverbal messages. Uh, so our part of that competence is being very thoughtful around, um, what sort of messages we are sending and taking that into account when we're communicating with other people. It talks about having initial encounters, a good first impression. You're going to smile, you're going to greet the people. Sometimes if you're off in the distance or ignoring the person when you're supposed to be meeting, they may interpret that in a certain way. So it talks about how nonverbal communication is multi-channel. So we rarely send nonverbal messages in isolation. So posture may be combined with a touch or eye behavior to create what's called the nonverbal cluster. So often we're sending multiple nonverbal messages at once. So I'm using my hand gestures. I also have a tone of voice and how I'm talking. That can be a nonverbal cluster to help convey meaning of my messages. And if you focus on too much on just one thing in isolation, you may be ignoring the rest of that message. Nonverbal congruency refers to the consistency among nonverbal expressions within a cluster. So, hey, does all these things add up? Do they go together? Or is there some incongruent things that aren't going together? Things that, they were trying to, they were smiling, they had their thumbs up, but their tone of voice just seemed like they weren't really. Maybe that was the one that gave them away that they weren't really happy with the situation. So again, you can be thoughtful around there. Nonverbal communication certainly affects our interactions with each other. It talks about, crossing your arms being closed off. Sometimes, I'm just cold right now, or this is more comfortable for me to have my arms up in this way, but it may be seen closed off or angry or upset. So again, being thoughtful, okay, I need to be open up. I need to be in this situation. And again, like I try and dress professionally when I'm teaching. People are going to interpret me differently if I'm giving this lecture with a shirt with a collar on than if I'm just wearing my Mario shirt in this situation. So again, it affects our interactions. Nonverbal communication can regulate the conversation. Again, using appropriate turn-taking signals. Introverts often wait for more than one signal or have a longer pause, whereas some other people, more extroverted, they're more willing to jump right in. So again, you may be on the lookout for other people's signals as well to say, hey, they want to jump into this conversation and create a welcoming space for them. I've known some extroverts that say, hey, sometimes I know I just need to shut up because I talk a lot and I take up a lot of space. So I need to be more thoughtful about picking up when other people want to jump into the conversation or when they've heard enough of me. Or maybe for me it's saying, hey, I need to be more, again, thoughtful or aggressive or assertive about jumping into those conversations. So the opposite end of that. And again, it depends on the person, it depends on the context or the situation. We can think through what's appropriate or what can we do differently. Right? When we look at miscommunication that happens, it's not like blaming, oh, it's your fault or it's my fault. Right? It's it's contributing. We're contributing to that based on our different cultural competences. You can be a great communicator and maybe you can navigate with someone who's not as great a communicator. I think there's some people who really good at adapting to a ton of different situations. But in most contexts, we're both partially at fault, right? It's not about blaming one person or another person and saying, oh, maybe I wasn't as clear as I could have been if they understood me differently. And maybe that person needed to listen a little bit better in the situation as well, or ask clarifying questions instead of just assuming the first thing they thought of was the correct way of decoding that interaction. So nonverbal communication relates to listening. Again, listening not just with the words that we're hearing, but how they're being said, and listening or paying attention to the other types of nonverbal communication that may be coming across. So it talks about listening with your eyes as well as your ears. Nonverbal communication relates to impression management. Again, we all have an identity that we want to express. So we may, if you're for an interview, you may dress up a little bit more to look professional. Certainly when I interviewed for this teaching job, I wore a suit coat and a nice button-down shirt. So it looked a little bit more professional than I would be wearing on a day-to-day basis. Because again, that impression matters. So guidelines for interpreting nonverbal messages. The first main point here is recognize that nonverbal signals are related. So being able to look to say, hey, are these different signals related or aren't they related, right? Being able to pick that up. And maybe if you can find multiple nonverbal signals, you'll get more nuanced understanding of what's behind those cues. So if they're progressive, so they're going one after another, or they're layered and multiple of them going together. So really looking for that the relationships between the nonverbal signals instead of just focusing on one little thing, right? If you just have one nonverbal signal, you may be misinterpreting it, or it may have just been unintentional, like, oh, why is he itching his ear? Well, my ear itches, right? I wasn't trying to communicate anything. But if you focus on that, you may overthink the situation. And then also read the nonverbal cues in context. So within the context, not just with the words that are being said, but also with the personal context or relationship that you have. Again, my friends know me as a nice person. So if they're reading something and I'm just coming off as short with them, it's like, oh, is Bradley tired? Is something going on? Is he mad at me? Right. So understanding that personal context and the relationship that you have. If you're talking to a stranger, you may have to be a little more thoughtful. It's like, hey, I know I'm really tired right now, but I need to make sure I'm not mumbling because I don't want them to interpret that in the wrong way. They don't know me and just know that's how I interact. That's a me thing and not a them thing, right? I don't want them to make me come across as rude. So sometimes I'll come across as more, be more intentional about being friendly with people I don't know as well, just because I don't know what their norms are or expectations, and I don't want them to misinterpret me being like an introvert as me not liking them, which does happen sometimes. People say, oh yeah, Bradley's not talking to me. Why is that? It's like, I'm an introvert. I just don't go up to random people and talk to them. But I know I have to do that sometimes because people otherwise may take it personally when it's not anything personal. I just didn't feel like talking in that situation. So this is a lot about nonverbal communication. Certainly nonverbal communication can be misinterpreted. And there's a lot of cultural nuances that need to be paid attention to. But the main thing here is that, again, said about 65% of our communication that we have is related to nonverbal communication. So we're reading those gestures, what the person's wearing, how they're saying things. All of this is part of message and how we're interpreting it. So it's important to pay attention to other people's nonverbal communication and be thoughtful about your own nonverbal communication, right? It's very involuntary most of the time, right? We're not intentionally communicating or making or thinking about how we're going to say something. But if we do notice some miscommunication, that's a good opportunity to follow up and clarify things. Or if we don't understand someone else's, again, you can use that verbal communication to help decode and clarify the messages. To make sure you're on the same page. You're co-creating that meeting and making that understanding between the people who are communicating can be very important. I think it never hurts to ask, right? It never hurts to clarify and follow up. And you may be able to read the situation better, especially as you get more nonverbal signals that are coming together. If it's just one thing, again, it may have you may be misinterpreting it. So be very thoughtful about that. Hopefully you found this helpful. There's a lot to learn about nonverbal communication. Certainly you could take an entire class on it. But this was a brief summary using the textbook, and I hope you found it helpful. Always feel free to reach out if you have any questions. I'm always glad to support people's understanding of this content. So thanks for watching.